Good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all today. I don't know if everyone knows who's in the audience, but this is the week of the Tech Awards. So not only do we have Fritjof Capra, our speaker, you've come to hear him, but also we have the laureates for the Tech Awards, or at least some of them here. And if you're here and you're a laureate, I'm going to ask you to stand in just a second, but I want to explain what that means. Every year, the Tech gives some awards for technology that benefits humanity.
Yeah, but this is different.
We have 5 categories: health, education, economic development, young entrepreneurs, and in the environment. And it's a very difficult competition to get to this point. These are the winners. They've been chosen from among hundreds of candidates, and they're here with us today. So if you're a Tech Award laureate, if you could stand, please do so. Thank you very much. So it's a week-long festivities here, culminating with the gala on Thursday night. Oh, we also have the winner of the Microsoft Imagine Cup from Portugal. If you could stand too. Congratulations. It's fitting that Fritjof Capra's book explores genius, because that is certainly what we have today. Many people who are experiencing genius in all sorts of ways. So let me just say a couple things. My name's Tim Ritchie, by the way. I'm the president of the Tech Museum. I've been here 2 years, and I am so thrilled to be a part of this institution in a community that really does believe it can change the world and is really about doing that. So it's exciting to be here. A couple things. This is the launch of the English version of Learning from Leonardo, and so we're really pleased that that would take place here at the Tech. And Dr. Capra will be signing books afterwards, and there's going to be a reception afterwards for you as well. We're pleased to have Angie Coiro here again for us to ask questions, which she'll do in just a little bit. And I just want to say one thing to try to put together the Tech Awards and this evening. One of the things that the Tech Awards reminds us, if we didn't need to know, is that technology does not really make us wise or kind or good. It just makes us powerful. So technology in the hands of people who aren't wise and kind and good can be horrific. And so at the Tech, we don't want to be value neutral about this. We want to say that what we want to build is a better community. And the kind of things that Fritjof Capra has been writing about over the years really bear on that. It's not a value-neutral view of technology, but it's a value-laden one that has a point of view about what is good and what is right. I think that's true also with our Tech Award laureates. They are actually giving their entire lives to something that matters deeply to make the world a better place. So it's thrilling to have them here. About Fritjof Capra, he is a physicist and a systems theorist, most famous to me anyway, coming through college for a book that he wrote called the Tao of Physics. But now he is also the director of the Center for Eco-Literacy. He also teaches at Schumacher College in England. He teaches at Berkeley here, and is a man of really many, many interests, pulling together science and all kinds of systems theories. I think part of what he's trying to tell us over the years is to look at the world holistically like the great Leonardo da Vinci did. So without further ado, we're pleased to welcome Fritjof Capra.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tim Ritchie, for this kind introduction. And thank you all for coming here. This is a very exciting day for me. You know, as an author, when you write a book, you have a certain idea and you carry it around for years, and then it slowly takes form, and you're working on a manuscript, and then the manuscript is finished and it goes to the publisher, and then there's a long editing process, and then it goes to the designers. Then you see the cover for the first time, then you get an advance copy. But the really exciting moment is when you see somebody else, and especially somebody you don't know, holding your book. And that's for me today. I've seen several of you holding the book, and that's a great excitement. So let me start with Leonardo da Vinci, the great genius of the Renaissance, here in his famous self-portrait. Leonardo has been the subject of hundreds of scholarly and popular books. There have been documentaries, there have been many exhibits, including one here at the Deck Museum, a big exhibit 5 years ago. However, there are surprisingly few books about Leonardo's science, even though he left voluminous notebooks full of detailed descriptions of his experiments, magnificent drawings, and long analyses of his findings. I've been fascinated by the genius of Leonardo da Vinci for several decades and have studied his scientific writings for the last 10 years in facsimile editions of his famous notebooks. I'm fortunate to be fluent in Italian, so I could read them in the original, at least in the facsimile editions. Leonardo's language actually was not Italian, but Tuscan. In the 15th century, Italian then slowly emerged from the Tuscan dialect. And if you speak Italian well, you can understand about 80% of Leonardo's Tuscan, but then there are some special words, and I made long lists of vocabularies of his special expressions. And in my new book, Learning from Leonardo, I present an in-depth discussion of the main branches of Leonardo's scientific work from the perspective of 21st century science. I discuss his fluid dynamics, his geology, his botany, his mechanics, his science of flight, and his anatomy. Most of his astonishing discoveries and achievements in these fields are virtually unknown to the general public. In fact, I opened the book with a timeline of about 50 of his most important scientific discoveries. Here you see a page with geology, and you see the discovery with the page reference in the book is on the left, and then you have the centuries after him, and it often took 2 or 3 or 4 more centuries for these discoveries being made again, because Leonardo did not publish anything during his lifetime. And even after his death, it took hundreds of years for the notebooks to be analyzed, transcribed, and analyzed. You may know that he was left-handed, and he wrote in mirror writing from right to left. And it's very difficult to read the original writing. So for hundreds of years, people just looked at the pictures, at the drawings, and didn't analyze the writings. So this graphic summary is an impressive reminder of Leonardo's pioneering genius in so many scientific fields. In the scientific language of today, we would call Leonardo da Vinci a systemic thinker. Understanding a problem for him, or a phenomenon, meant connecting it with other phenomena through a similarity of patterns. Here, for example, he draws various turbulent flows of water. You see, he put a board into a river and then studies the turbulence. But the one in the middle is not water, it's human hair. That's a braid of human hair. So he compares the flow of water and the flow of human hair. He also compared the flow of water in the rivers and creeks of the earth, which he called the veins of the earth, with the flow of blood in the veins, the flow of sap in plants and trees. He always made these comparisons in different fields. So he usually worked on several problems at the same time. And when his understanding progressed in one area, he went to other areas that are connected and revised his works there. So in a sense, you could see the progress of his science as a sort of spiral going round and round repeatedly to various areas and making progress and moving upward to greater knowledge. Now, therefore, to appreciate the full extent of his genius, one needs to be aware of the evolution of his thinking in several parallel but interconnected disciplines. And this has been my approach to absorbing his work and to understanding his scientific thought. And I can say that Learning from Leonardo is the first book in which the full body of his scientific work is presented in this coherent and integrated way from a systemic perspective. For me, this was sort of natural because I have myself contributed to the systems view of life that has emerged in science over the last 30 years or so, and I've written several books about it. And so I found it very natural to analyze and interpret Leonardo's science from that perspective. Indeed, I believe that the ever-present emphasis on relationships, on patterns, on qualities, on transformations throughout his writings was what fascinated me many years ago and what kept me fascinated over the last 10 years. What emerged from my explorations of all the branches of Leonardo's science was the realization that ultimately, at the most fundamental level, Leonardo always sought to understand the nature of life. So my main thesis is that the science of Leonardo da Vinci is a science of living forms, radically different from the mechanistic science of Galileo, Descartes, and Newton that emerged 200 years later. Here you see a very famous drawing of a plant known as the Star of Bethlehem, and you see exaggerated spirals in the leaves, which actually do not occur in nature. But he exaggerated it so as to make the comparison between the growth of plants and water turbulence, again, a water whirlpool. Now, Leonardo's art served his persistent quest for life's inner secrets. In order to paint nature's living forms, he felt that he needed a scientific understanding of their intrinsic nature and underlying principles. And in order to analyze the results of his observations, he needed his artistic ability to depict them. So I believe that this is the very essence of his synthesis of science and art. He needed science to paint, and he needed art to do his science. Now, Leonardo himself thought of himself not only as an artist and a natural philosopher, as scientists were called at the time, but also thought of himself as an inventor. In his view, an inventor was someone who created an artifact or work of art by assembling various elements into a new configuration that does not exist in nature. Now, when you think of that, this definition comes very close to our modern notion of a designer. And a designer takes various elements and puts them together into new forms. And indeed, Leonardo's synthesis is a synthesis of art, science, and design. And in all three dimensions, he uses living nature as his mentor and his model. As I delved into the notebooks, I discovered not only Leonardo, the systemic thinker, but also, to my great surprise, Leonardo, the ecologist and eco-designer. In this picture, for example, he draws the bones of a wing of a bird. And experts in the history of technology find it very hard to tell whether this is the wing of an actual bird or whether it's the wing of one of his flying machines. So close was he to imitating nature. You could see you could say in modern terms, he was the father of biomimicry. And this is why his synthesis is not only intellectually fascinating, but also extremely relevant to our time. The persistent endeavor to put life at the very center of his art, science, and design, and the recognition that all natural phenomena are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent are important lessons we can learn from Leonardo today. As we recognize that our sciences and technologies have become increasingly narrow in their focus, unable to understand the multifaceted, multidisciplinary problems of our time, we urgently need a science and technology that honor and respect the unity of all life, that recognize the fundamental interdependence of all phenomena, and reconnect us with the living earth. This is exactly the kind of synthesis Leonardo da Vinci outlined and practiced 500 years ago. There are also more personal lessons that we can learn from Leonardo. In the prologue of the book, I identify 7 signs of his genius. I actually read 2 books by psychologists about the nature of genius, and it seems there are mental attributes that are characteristic of all geniuses, from Hildegard von Bingen to Shakespeare, Newton, Mozart, Einstein, and so on. And these characteristics include, first of all, a relentless curiosity, also a kind of intellectual fearlessness to tackle whatever problem is in the way, a capacity for intense concentration, attention to detail, and what I call a holistic memory, the ability to memorize large amounts of information in the form of a coherent whole. For example, it was said of Isaac Newton that he would keep a mathematical problem in his head and solve it in his head, and sometimes didn't publish it for months and always had it in his head, in his memory. The German poet Goethe went, in the 18th century, went on long coach rides and entertained his fellow passengers by reciting his novels from memory, word for word. There's a story of Mozart, that Mozart went to a concert that included a complex choral arrangement plus orchestra, and then he went home and wrote it all down. The orchestra, the chorus, everything, note by note. So this kind of holistic memory is typical of geniuses, it seems. There's a story about Leonardo written by one of his contemporaries who remembered that when this man was a child, Leonardo was working on this big bronze sculpture of an equestrian monument in Milan, and he had a big studio, and he was also working on the Last Supper in the church of Santa Maria delle Grazie, which was a block away across the square. And this historian says he remembers as a child seeing Leonardo running across the square, climbing up on the scaffolding of the Last Supper, taking a brush and making some corrections in the face of an apostle, and then going back and continuing the work on his horse. So he had this in his mind all the time. This is what I call holistic memory. Now, of course, most of us will not be able to develop these characteristics of genius to any such extent, but we can all be inspired by Leonardo's specific ways of work and we can learn valuable lessons from his method. In previous years, scholars of Leonardo's notebooks tended to see them as disorganized and chaotic. And as you can see from this picture, they are really a jumble of drawings. Many of these pages, a jumble of drawings and writings. Others are more structured and organized. But it is very difficult to follow Leonardo's thought, especially because he never dated his notebooks, and because paper was expensive. He often used pages when there was half a page free of something that he had written 5 years ago. He used the page again and wrote something else. Well, it was only in the 1970s that these notebooks were properly dated, and that, of course, is a kind of a detective work. But now we can follow his thought, and when you do that, you see that that at least is my view, that in his mind, his science was not disorganized at all. He had a very coherent view of natural phenomena and how to describe them. And in fact, there are many notes to himself, reminders to himself that he writes in the notebooks. Be sure to write this before that, and I will write a book called that and that. So, and from that you can get an idea of how he wanted to arrange his material for publication, which he always had in mind but never got around to it. So I tried to arrange the chapters of Learning from Leonardo in this order that I feel he would have arranged them. For example, there's a note where he says, be sure to put the chapter on elements of mechanics before the chapter on anatomy, so that you can show how the muscles and tendons move the bones. So you will find a chapter on mechanics before the chapter on anatomy, and it has the title Elements of Mechanics that Leonardo gave it. Also, the title on the chapter on fluid dynamics I have called The Movements of Water. Another one I called The Human Figure. Those are all his titles that he wanted to use. So in a sense, I feel that I have followed his instructions in organizing my book. Well, a fundamental idea underlying Leonardo's scientific writings is that nature as a whole is alive, and that the patterns and processes in the macrocosm of the Earth are similar to those in the microcosm of the human body. Here in this head of a study for his painting of the Leda, we see again the hair flowing like water waves, again the same comparison, flow of hair and flow of water. So I have divided the contents of the book into two basic categories: nature's forms and transformations in the macrocosm and in the microcosm. In the macrocosm, the main themes of Leonardo's science are the movements of water, the geological forms and transformations of the living earth, and the botanical diversity and growth patterns of plants. In the microcosm, his main focus was on the human body, its beauty and proportions, the mechanics of its movements, and how it compared to other animal bodies in motion, in particular the flight of birds. So, in the time I have, let me give you just a very brief overview over these various branches of his science. Leonardo was fascinated by water in all its manifestations. He recognized its fundamental role as life's medium and vital fluid, as the matrix of all organic forms. He wrote, "It is the expansion and humor of all living bodies. Without it, nothing retains its original form." He uses the word humor here in the medieval sense of a vital fluid. Now, this view of the essential role of water in biological life is, of course, fully borne out by modern science. We know today not only that all living organisms need water for transporting nutrients to their tissues, but also that life on Earth began in water, and that for billions of years, all the cells that compose living organisms have continued to flourish and evolve in watery environments. So Leonardo was completely correct in viewing water as the carrier and matrix of life. Throughout his life, he studied its movements and flows, drew and analyzed its waves and vortices, and he experimented not only with water, but also investigated the flows of blood, of wine, of oil, and even of grains of sand or grains of millet. And he recognized that the principles of flow are the same in all these instances. And this is why we speak today of fluid dynamics, the dynamics of flow. And we can say today that Leonardo was not only a pioneer in this discipline of fluid dynamics, but he literally created it single-handedly. This is one field of science that did not exist before him. I was especially fascinated by his experiments with granular materials because he showed in this a very modern way of thinking. He thought to himself, observing water, it's very difficult to see, it's impossible to see the water particles, so it's very difficult to trace out the flow lines of water. So he said, let's take a barrel of rice and tip it over, and I can actually see the rice corns and can follow the flow. Now, this is what we call a theoretical model in modern science, or a scientific model, to take a simpler phenomenon to gain knowledge about a more complex phenomenon that we cannot access that easily. And you find this in Leonardo's work again and again. You find it in geology, in anatomy, in most branches of his science. He uses this scientific method, scientific models. And so he was a century ahead of his time in doing so. Leonardo saw water as the chief agent in the formation of the Earth's surface. So this awareness of the continual interaction of water and rocks impelled him to undertake extensive studies in geology. So what he did was not that he said, I'm tired of mechanics, let's do some geology. He studied water, and he studied water in nature, and he realized that there was a strong connection with rocks. So water led him to the study of rocks, to the study of geology. And his geological observations are stunning, not only by their great accuracy, but also because they led him to formulate general principles that were rediscovered only centuries later and are still used by geologists today. For example, he was the first to postulate that the forms of the Earth are the result of slow processes going on over long stretches of time, which we now call geological time. With this view, he was centuries ahead of his time. Geologists became aware of the great duration of geological time only in the 19th century, with the work of Charles Lyell, who is usually seen as the father of modern geology. Leonardo's notebooks also contain numerous drawings of trees and flowering plants, many of them masterpieces of botanical imagery. These drawings were at first made for studies for paintings, but soon turned into genuine scientific inquiries about the patterns of metabolism and growth underlying all botanical forms. Leonardo paid special attention to the nourishment of plants by sunlight and water, and to the transport of vital sap through the plant's tissues. He was the first to recognize that the age of a tree corresponds to the number of rings in the trunk, and even more remarkably, that the width of the rings, of the growth rings, give us an indication of the climate during that time. Now, it takes quite a bit of biological knowledge, of botanical knowledge. You really have to understand how these tree rings are formed to understand that dry or wet climate influences the width of the rings. So as in so many fields, Leonardo carried his thinking in botany far beyond that of his peers. We have to see him as really the first great theorist in botany. Now, what I found so fascinating is that when you ask people who was Leonardo da Vinci, they will not say he was the first theoretical botanist, nor will they say he was a pioneer in geology. This is virtually unknown. Now, whenever he explored the forms of nature in the macrocosm, he also looked for similarities of patterns and processes in the human body. And in order to study the body's organic forms, he dissected numerous corpses of humans and animals and examined their bones, joints, muscles, and nerves, drawing them with an accuracy and clarity never seen before. He demonstrated in countless elaborate and stunning drawings based on his dissections how nerves, muscles, tendons, and bones work together to move the body. This is a especially remarkable drawing, which is almost like a cinematographic view as the shoulder turns. In fact, on the opposite page, there are another 4 positions of the shoulder. So you really have a 180-degree rotation if you put the 2 drawings together. It's also interesting that unlike Descartes, 200 years later, Leonardo never thought of the body as a machine, even though he was a brilliant mechanical engineer and invented countless machines and mechanical devices. He clearly understood that the means of the body's movements were mechanical, but that didn't mean for him that the body was a machine. The origin of the movements lay in the soul, as he would say. And I make a point that his concept of the soul comes very close to our modern concept of cognition. So, to understand in detail how nature's mechanical instruments, as he called them, work together to move the body, Leonardo immersed himself in prolonged studies involving weights, forces, and movements, the branches of mechanics we now call statics, dynamics, and kinematics. While he studied the elementary principles of mechanics in relation to the movements of the human body, he also applied them to the design of numerous new machines. And as his fascination with the science of mechanics grew, he explored ever more complex topics, anticipating abstract principles that were centuries ahead of his time. It was quite astonishing to me that even though there are numerous very beautiful books about Leonardo's mechanical engineering, about his various machines, there's not a single book today on his theoretical mechanics, which was absolutely astounding. And so the chapter on mechanics is in fact the longest chapter in my book. And his discoveries include an understanding of the relativity of motion, his discovery of a principle now known as Newton's third law, namely that for every force going in one direction, there's an equal and opposite force. And as the name says, Newton rediscovered this 200 years after Leonardo. Leonardo also had an intuitive grasp of the conservation of energy, something that was really clarified only in the 17th century. And perhaps most remarkably, he anticipated the law of energy dissipation, the fact that in every phenomenon or in every machine, there's always energy lost, dissipated through heat, friction, and so on. Today, this is known as the second law of thermodynamics, and Leonardo had a very clear anticipation of it in the 15th century. From the texts that accompany Leonardo's anatomical drawings, we know that he considered the human body as an animal body, as we do in biology today. And so it is not surprising that he compared human movements with the movements of various animals. Here, for example, we have the emotional expression of anger or rage in the face of a horse, of a lion, and of a human being at the bottom. And by the way, at the very top, he draws a dragon just for fun. So when he studied the animal body, he compared the gait of animals to the way we walk as human beings. He also studied the motion of fish in water. But what fascinated him most was the flight of birds, because that was one of the great passions of his life, the dream of flying. Now, the dream of flying as like a bird is as old as humanity itself. And here we have a picture of the mythical figure Daedalus with his wing. And this picture actually is to be found on the campanile of the Cathedral of Florence, and was there when Leonardo was an apprentice in Florence. So he must have walked by this picture hundreds of times, and who knows, maybe it was this sculpture that inspired him. Well, Leonardo's science of flight involved numerous disciplines, from aerodynamics to human anatomy, the anatomy of birds, and mechanical engineering. In my chapter on the science of flight, I analyze his drawings and writings on this subject in some detail, and I come to the conclusion that he had a clear understanding of the origin of aerodynamic lift, that is the pressure difference, say in a wing of a bird, or today in an airplane wing, the pressure difference of top and bottom, which gives the wing the lift. He also understood the essential features of both gliding and flapping flight, which is not that easy. I read 3 books on the flight of birds. It's a complex way. Birds don't keep themselves in the air by flapping the wings up and down. The flapping of the wings actually is for the locomotion, for the thrust forward, and then the aerodynamic effect of the wing keeps the bird up. He also was the first to recognize what we now call the principle of the wind tunnel, namely that an object flying through stationary air underlies the same laws as a stationary object in the wind. So that's why we call this the principle of the wind tunnel. In his numerous designs of flying machines, Leonardo attempted to imitate the complex flapping and gliding movements of birds. And many of these designs were based on sound aerodynamic principles, and it was only the weight of the materials available at the time, leather, cloth, wood, strings, and so on, that made it impossible for him to fly, because human muscle power is just not strong enough to lift these heavy materials. And he realized that. He made estimated calculations and came to the conclusion that flapping flight is not possible for humans, but then he said gliding flight might be possible. And in our time, many engineers, or several engineers, have reconstructed Leonardo's flying machines and have found that they actually work. Now, I mentioned before that Leonardo's forms are living forms continually shaped and transformed by underlying processes. Throughout his life, he studied, drew, and painted the rocks and sediments of the earth shaped by water, the growth of plants shaped by their metabolism, and the anatomy of the body in motion. His ultimate goal in his science as well as in his art was always to understand the nature of life. This persistent quest culminated in the anatomical studies he undertook when he was over 60, first in Milan and then in Rome, and especially in his investigations of the human heart. Here we have a magnificent double folio with several views of the heart. Nobody had pictured the heart like this before him. He discovered many of its functions, many subtle details. One of them was only discovered in the early 20th or in the mid-20th century. Now, during the last decade of his life, Leonardo became intensely interested in another aspect of the mystery of life, its origin in the processes of reproduction and embryonic development. Here's another stunning drawing of a fetus in the womb. In his embryological studies, he described the life processes of the fetus in the womb, including its nourishment through the umbilical cord in astonishing detail. More than that, these embryological drawings are graceful and touching revelations of the mysteries surrounding the origin of life. They epitomize the artist's great care, sensitivity, and tremendous respect for life. To me, they exude a tenderness that is deeply moving. Leonardo was fascinated by the mystery of the origin of life, not only in his science, but also in his art. His most famous painting, the Mona Lisa, was originally a portrait of a young Florentine lady, Lisa del Giocondo. It was commissioned by her wealthy husband, but for some unknown reason, Leonardo never delivered the painting. He kept it with him for 10 years, the last 10 years of his life, and during those 10 years, he transformed it into his personal meditation on the origin of life. The painting is different from his other portraits. In fact, it is different from all other portraits. The difference lies in the strong contrast between the mellow features of the figure in the foreground and the wild austerity of the archaic landscape in the background. The forms of the earth are portrayed here in ceaseless movement and transformation. As the primordial waters cut through the rocks, carving out valleys and depositing masses of gravel and sand, which eventually will turn into fertile soil. What we see here is the birth of the living earth out of the waters of the primeval oceans. Now we know that the Gioconda, as she's called in Italy, was a young mother, and she may even have been pregnant when she sat for the portrait. It is evident that the central theme of Leonardo's celebrated masterpiece is the procreative power of life, both in the female body and in the body of the living earth. Well, Leonardo knew very well that ultimately the nature and origin of life would remain a mystery to him, no matter how brilliant his scientific mind. He wrote when he was in his late 40s, "Nature is full of infinite causes that have never occurred in experience." And as he got older, his sense of mystery deepened. Nearly all the figures in his last paintings have that smile that expresses the ineffable, often combined with a pointing finger. Mystery to Leonardo, wrote the famous art historian Kenneth Clark, was a shadow, a smile, and a finger pointing into darkness. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So we're going to have a Q&A, and thank you all very much for being here. You found some papers on your seats when you arrived, and you're welcome to jot down any questions or comments, anything you'd like us to expound on while our conversation. We definitely want to be part of that. So as we're talking, or right now, go ahead and jot down your question or your thought and hold it up, and Leslie will gather up to the back, and she'll send it up to me on the laptop. Do you have a profile you prefer to present? Left, right?
I should think about that.
You should.
Yeah, it's an important issue.
I see the celebrity culture hasn't gotten to you,
No,
obviously.
No.
It's a wonderful presentation, and
Thank you.
I think the thing that surprised me most came right up front, the fact that the study of Leonardo's science is lagging so far behind the study of him as an artist. And you mentioned
Yes.
the mirror writing.
Right.
What else got in the way of studying him as a scientist?
Well, I think what got in the way was that already during his life, he kept his science secret. His art was public. Like all the great painters, he had disciples. He had a studio. He published, not during his life, but soon after his life, his favorite disciple, Francesco Melzi, published, following Leonardo's instructions, something called Treatise on Painting, where he told painters, you know, when you paint a figure, do this and that, you know, how to deal with light and shadow and so on. So he freely shared his experience of painting, but he kept his science secret. So there was always a kind of mystery around him. People knew that he was doing great things in natural philosophy, as it was called, but nobody knew exactly what. And then after his death, you know, various, especially British aristocrats like the Earl of Leicester and Foster and so on, these codices are now named after them, bought them, you know, for the drawings. And they didn't care about the writings, so it stayed a secret.
For the most part, I'd like to focus on the gist of what we're talking about, the systematic approach to science, et cetera. But I have to ask, in your research, were you able to approach, be near, be exposed to any of these items in their original form? You mentioned that you worked with reproductions of the journals,
yes.
Of course. Were you actually in the presence of any of the real stuff, something he actually touched, wrote on, drew on?
Yes, I was fortunate to, this little booklet that I showed, this notebook, is called the Codex Forster, and I actually held it in my hands, and I could see the difference between the original and the facsimile, which is not very big because these facsimiles are published by a special publisher called Giunti in Italy, and they not only photograph the pages, they exactly reproduce the little notebook. It has a little string on it and a piece of wood to close it. It has wine spots on it. Some of the pages are torn. The facsimile has all of that. The only difference really is the quality of the paper, because it's photographic paper. And in the Renaissance, they had very good paper. So the paper is still very, but you can't really go and touch the paper like this because, you know, it's very difficult to hold it in the first place. But it is, but I have to tell you that most of my research I did at UCLA, where Armand Hammer created a Leonardo Center, and they have a complete collection of facsimiles. And when you hold that, you know, you already feel that you're sort of looking over his shoulder, seeing what he does. You know, they're very impressive. And they are available. You can buy for $4,000 for a little booklet like this.
I'm sure we'll all get right on that. Actually, one of the audience members anticipated one of my questions, asking what was Leonardo's personal life like? And if I can expand on that a bit, what produces a Leonardo in terms of someone who has that systematic approach to research, to science, to seeing life as a whole, and what in his personal life might have enabled that?
Well, this is a question I asked myself at the very beginning, and I didn't find an answer. First, I read these books about genius by various psychologists, so we can say what made him a genius, what the characteristics are, but how he acquired these characteristics, we really can't tell. And when you look at various geniuses, you see that Johann Wolfgang Goethe, for instance, came from a wealthy family, had an excellent academic education. So did Isaac Newton. Shakespeare's parents were not very remarkable. He grew up in a just ordinary family. Leonardo was an illegitimate child growing up on a farm. So we can't really tell how he became a genius. And also, you know, he was very secretive about his personal life. For example, we know that he was gay. It's commonly assumed because he was always surrounded by beautiful young men whom he also drew. There's no relationship with a woman that we have any record of. But we don't know, we don't have any hard evidence, whereas his contemporary Michelangelo, the other great painter of the Renaissance, was openly gay. He published love poems to his lovers. Leonardo kept it all enclosed and secret.
And it sounds like that was consistent with the rest of his life. Rather than isolating that one thing to keep secret, he just was secret about his whole life.
Yes. And in these thousands of pages of notebooks, there's hardly any passage with anything emotional in it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, he was... now, we know that he was emotional from his paintings. Mm-hmm. He was famous for portraying emotions, very subtle emotions, in masterful ways. But his own emotions he kept to himself.
What about in terms of setting his genius aside? I'm wondering about the connection between the fact that he grew up in a theocracy. You know, religion was part of everyone's life. He fluctuated between being a Catholic and being a deist. You know, he wasn't always a rigid Catholic. But I wonder how much his idea that there was a God and that God created everything, I wonder how much that influenced his worldview, that all these things are interconnected.
Not much.
Really?
No, not much. He refers to the Creator in a few formal passages that he thought would be read by others. But when he wrote for himself in his private notes, he refers to nature. And it's clear that he sees the nature as awesome and divine. He doesn't use the term divine, but he says, nature ordained that such and such. Nature made animals in such a way. So clearly it's nature as the creator. But also in his private notes, he makes fun of the church and he makes fun of religion. So for example, there's a long passage where he discusses fossils and how did these marine fossils get up to the top of the mountains. And he has very cogent arguments about, you know, that they originated in the ocean, and then when the mountains rose, they got up there. The current theory at the time was that they got up in the mountains with the deluge, Noah's flood. And he counters that by saying, well, according to those who measured it, according to those who kept the time, the flood lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. No? So he makes really fun of these church teachings. Evidently, he didn't publish that.
How much of the science that he was engaged in would have angered the church had they known about it?
Well, what would have angered the church most, and what did anger the Pope, because he got wind of it, was his view of the soul. Leonardo took the Aristotelian concept of the soul as not only the source of knowledge and consciousness, but also as the form, as the life force, a force that formed the body. He called it the composer of the body, which is why I can say that our modern science of cognition, cognitive science, has very much this idea of cognition as the dynamics of self-organization of an organism. And Leonardo's concept of the soul came very close, but that was not the Christian concept. And when the Pope heard of that, he banned him. Leonardo lived in Rome at the time. He banned him from doing anatomies, dissections. Not because it was forbidden to dissect bodies, that's sort of commonly said, but it's not true exactly, but because of his view of the soul.
Wow.
But also I should say that Leonardo was lucky in the sense that those 67 years he lived were a relatively tolerant period. Tolerant because the popes of the Renaissance had other things to do than watch over theological purity. They had their feasts, they had mistresses, they had children, they lived the good life. They didn't care about theological purity. So Leonardo had this window where he didn't have to fear the Vatican. 100 years later, we know the story of Galileo was very different.
We have a lot of questions coming in about the notebooks themselves, so let me go through some of these. Especially the question as to whether they've been transcribed online, where someone can see them in English.
Yes, and only, actually not in English. Some maybe. If you just Google the name of the notebooks, I think especially the Codex Leicester, which is now owned by Bill Gates, I think that you can see online with the translation. If you speak Italian, you're in luck. You can see all of them, all the facsimiles by the Vinci Library. It's called the Leonardo Library in Vinci, where he was born. And it's, the website is called E-Leo, E-Leo. And when you go to that, you get all of them. And you may have, there may be others, you know, but since I speak Italian, I didn't look for others, and I wanted to read them in the original anyway.
Do you think a great deal would be lost if it went to English, just with the differences in the language, if you were to read an English translation?
No, you can read them in English, but I must say that I retranslated many of the passages. That's a matter of taste, you know. You see, you can either put it into modern language, into modern English, or you put it into a little old-fashioned English, which they did in the 19th century, so they sound a little funny to us, those translations. Or you can put it as literally as possible how Leonardo wrote it in Italian. That's what I did. So it's a spoken Italian, an everyday informal language, and that's what I used in my translations.
Question from the audience. After going through the notebooks, do you think we should change the way that we're teaching science?
Well, yes, I think I've thought that long before I studied Leonardo, but we can learn from Leonardo that the way we teach science, it's very important today to put life into the very center of the science teaching, because most of the phenomena that surround us are living phenomena, whether we talk about our health, our economics, you know, government, we have social systems, we have ecosystems, we have individual organisms, and they're all living systems. So life, to put life into the center, as Leonardo did, would be a huge change in teaching science. And I'm happy to tell you that while I worked on Leonardo, I also wrote a textbook with this in mind, which is called The Systems View of Life. And it will come out next year by Cambridge University Press. And that's where I have life at the center.
And what level is that aimed at?
University students, undergraduates.
Can you give us an example of a line of study that you think has strayed from the idea of a systematic approach to sciences, and how it would look different if life were at the center of that line of study?
Well, for example, we would do agriculture in a way that is gleaned from nature. We would observe, for instance, plants that attract pests, and we would plant those around our fields so the pests don't go into the corn, but the pests go into those plants. And these methods are known as agroecology. We would do agroecology instead of genetic engineering or chemical agriculture that have many side effects. Medicine is the same thing. We would not practice a medicine based on drugs and based, again, although they had no success so far on genetic engineering, but we would do a medicine based on the self-healing capabilities of the body and study those and encourage the patient to heal herself rather than through medical intervention. I mean, you can go almost into any field. Design, we would design our cities with nature in mind, our technologies, with biomimicry, things copied from nature. Our economics, we would have an economics that is embedded in ecosystems and in social systems. So almost every field you go into, it's quite a strong reversal.
It would also be a reversal, at least if I'm hearing it properly, it would be a reversal of some of the motivations of studying. There are two ways to fund studies right now. One is, you get nonprofit grants in university, or you have, privately funded, profit-driven. You hope to make a technology or a product that will sell, and it sounds as though you might lose part of that equation if you started doing life-centered work.
Yes, I think so. Although you could also make a profit with biomimicry and other kind of biotechnologies. You could still make a profit, but the profit motive would not be at the center.
I can imagine that would be problematic for some folks.
Yes, but it will be better for the 99%.
Question from the audience, what were some of Leonardo's most significant holistic themes?
Well, I mentioned most of them. I think maybe the most significant was that when you look at living forms, at biological forms, you realize that they are shaped by underlying processes. And in order to understand the forms, you need to understand the processes. Another one would be that there are similar patterns in all living systems. For instance, he compared wrinkled skin of an old person to the wrinkles of an orange. When you cut an orange and leave it out for several days or weeks, then the skin becomes wrinkly. I mean, the flesh becomes dry and wrinkly. And he realized that this is the same process. It's living tissue that gets old, loses the vitality, loses the fluids, and becomes wrinkly. And so that would be the same pattern in two different areas. And he did this throughout his work. And then the other one I would say that I mentioned, which fascinates me most, is this technique of model making. I'll give you another example of that. He discovered something called the continuity principle in fluid dynamics, namely that when you have a river of a certain width and then it narrows, the velocity of the water is faster in the narrow part than in the broad part, because otherwise, it wouldn't work. The water couldn't get through. And so he said, imagine a regiment of soldiers marching through a street, shoulder to shoulder, and the street narrows, then the guys in the narrow part have to walk faster for the others to get through. So a very simple analogy that explains the behavior of water. So I'm just really enchanted by these theoretical models that he used again and again. And I'm sorry that I couldn't put the one with the soldiers in the book, because the drawing is really sloppy. It's really, he just did something. It was not one of his usually beautiful drawings, but it's a fantastic model.
Can you describe the relationship between Leonardo and Michelangelo?
And
Michelangelo.
They didn't like each other. Michelangelo was a generation younger, and Michelangelo was a hothead. He got into fights. He actually had a broken nose from a fist fight, and he would accost Leonardo in the streets of Florence and taunt him and tease him. And Leonardo was a very serene person, but he didn't like that at all, and so they didn't get along well. There was no real significant interaction between the two.
It's kind of sad when you have that kind of mental capacity. You can't find that many compatriots. So I think they might have bonded.
Yeah.
Back to the notebooks. Do you find it a paradox that Leonardo was so organized in his thinking but never published? And with that in mind, do you think he anticipated someday this might see the light of day?
Yes, he did. We know, and I say this in the book, he talked about publication several times. He would sit down at one occasion in his life. He had to be in Florence for some legal case of an inheritance for a month. and he sat down in the house of a friend with all the notebooks and started reorganizing them. But he didn't get very far. And I think what happened was that he was so curious that when he was rewriting, copying notebooks, for instance, there's a codex called Codex Madrid, Codex Madrid 1, there are two of them. It's one of the main sources of mechanics. And he lays it out beautifully with drawings on the side and you know, the statements and principles in the text. And then he gets carried away and goes off on a tangent. And then it starts going in ever which direction because he has new ideas and he explores new ideas. So rather than publishing what he has already established, he was always more engaged in new ideas. And he always thought that in the end he would publish. And there are some reminders for future publishers in his notebooks, but he never got around to it.
One of the things that struck me looking over the book, the pictures were fascinating, but when I first opened the book, the first thing I started to do was just page through and look at these pictures, many of which I hadn't seen before. And I was overwhelmed by how many different directions this brilliant mind was capable of going in depth, you know, where anyone would have been pleased to do 3, 4 of these lines of studies. Yes. And I wonder if that has shed any light on what a typical day was like for him.
Well, my personal theory is that he didn't sleep. You know, I'm sure he slept very little, maybe 3 or 4 hours, not more. Because he did so much, as you say, he went into such depth. And when you read the notebooks about a particular subject, say the sedimentation of rocks, the way water deposit rocks, it goes on for page after page. And it gets, at a certain point, it gets really boring because you have read it already and he repeats it and it gives another example. He just goes on and on and on. And he also painted the Mona Lisa on the side, you know? I mean, and let's not forget that he was employed by the courts of the Renaissance princes in Florence, Milan, and Rome, at the papal court in Rome. And they asked him to produce spectacles, theater productions, costumes for pageantry. He did all of this, and he did it as seriously as his science. He just, once he concentrated on a task, he concentrated.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's the level of concentration he was able to
I think
attend.
so, yes. And, you know, he also took time off. He was said to be very charming in court, very persuasive, entertaining. He wrote stories, fables, riddles, games for the people at the court. But then he would take off for weeks and nobody would know where he was, and he did his science, his meditation, his thinking. So he needed, and he writes about this also, he needed the solitary life of a philosopher and researcher, and he could also do the courtly life.
More questions on the notebook. In what style and person did Leonardo write?
Well, that's a very good question. Actually, this is, with my first book on Leonardo, I gave quite a few talks, and nobody has asked me that question before. But it's a really good one because his first medium was visual, was drawing and painting. His second medium was speaking, and only the third was writing. So many scholars have said, and that puzzled me very much in the beginning, that Leonardo is not capable of advancing a good argument, and he's not persuasive in his writing because the text is not laid out in an academic fashion. So the trick is, if you can, to read him aloud. And when you read him aloud, and I have a brother who is a filmmaker in Los Angeles, and we grew up together and both lived in Italy, and we are both fluent in Italian. So I would do my research at UCLA, take a lot of notes, and then come and stay with my brother and read Leonardo to him. And I realized that when you read him aloud, you find a rhythm and an elegance and often a great sense of humor. And that was his language. And it was also, you know, very, very informal language that he would write a paragraph. If you say that sculpture is superior to painting, I say no. And now I will tell you why. And then he goes his argument, and you feel like sitting down and having a glass of wine with him, you know, and he explains things to you. He often writes in this very personal tone, and often he chooses potential partners of dialogue to write, to make his arguments. So it's a lot of fun to read him.
He created a second party in the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Do you think Leonardo's lack of schooling as a child was instrumental in his development as a genius?
Absolutely. Well, not as a genius, but as for the development of his scientific method. Because at the time, when you went to school, you learned rhetoric, you learned Latin and rhetoric that told you how to form an argument. And if you didn't do it that way, you wouldn't pass. And you also learned how to read the classics, and doing mathematics meant reading Euclid, and doing geography meant reading Ptolemy, and you always read the classics and never discussed them. You just absorbed them and learned them. Leonardo wrote in one passage, they strut around and puff up, proud of their achievements, but the feathers on their hats are really the feathers of others. And then he said, I don't need to do that. I can go to nature directly, and nature is my mistress. And then he adds, because if you can go to the well, you don't need the water jug. This is a nice kind of simile. He was very proud of his scientific method, that he could engage in a dialogue with nature. Now, having said that, I also have to say that he did read the classics as much as he could. In that, he was a real scientist. He always started with traditional knowledge, and then he looked whether the traditional knowledge corresponded to his experiments and observations or not. But he did not base anything just on traditional knowledge.
It's a good question. Did any of Leonardo's manuals prefigure Darwin's On the Origin of Species? Do you see any direct line between the two?
There is no direct line to Darwin, but there are two indirect lines. And in the book, I talk about that. Leonardo had a kind of early evolutionary thinking in two ways. One way is in geology. He realized that the forms of the Earth were shaped over long periods of time that we now call geological time. And so he observed, or he imagined how valleys were carved out by rivers, how sedimentation and erosion contributed to what we now call the rock cycle. So these are sort of evolutionary thoughts in geology. Now, interestingly, Darwin also started out with geology. He was inspired by geology in his evolutionary thinking. The second time was that when Leonardo studied the anatomy of animals, he saw similarities of forms. Now we know that, our bones of the arm are similar to that of a dog or the leg of a horse or, any kind of mammal. And Leonardo realized that. And so this idea that there are certain fundamental forms and that different animals represent different variations of the same form. That was then revived in Germany in the 18th century, where these forms were called archetypes, so Urtypen in German. And Darwin said in his writings that he was influenced by this theory in his early evolutionary thinking. So there is a direct line to Leonardo.
A similar line to that, it scrolled up out of sight. We're going to find that. Any connection between Newton's work and Leonardo's notebooks?
Oh, lots, yeah. In my chapter of mechanics, actually more to Galileo, because Galileo was closer to him, but also to Newton. As I said, the so-called Newton's third law was something Leonardo discovered. It's interesting that Leonardo paid a lot of attention to conservation. I mentioned the conservation of energy, but also he realized the conservation of mass. And he even said that when an object moves, the space it takes up is equal to the space it leaves behind. So this idea of the conservation of a quantity, and it's interesting, if you read books about Newton, historians will tell you that Newton realized the existence of conservation laws, but he didn't like them. And no, I shouldn't say he didn't like them. He didn't attach importance to them. It was not something important for him. It was very important for Leonardo.
For a moment, I thought he protested the laws of
No.
No real point there.
No.
Do you think there are undiscovered inventions in his writings that could still be investigated?
Well, first of all, we have to realize that half of his manuscripts are lost. You know, he left about 12,000 pages. We have about 6,000. And those codices Madrid that I mentioned were discovered in the 1960s. They had been lost. They had been known, and then in the 16th century, then they had been lost for several centuries, and then they were found again. And who knows, we might find others. But, you know, looking through all these notebooks and writings and trying to form a coherent picture, you of course think what is missing and what might have he done that we don't have, and other scholars have speculated. So we think that he wrote a complete book on botany, which is lost. I personally think that he must have written about astronomy, because there's nothing about astronomy in the extant writings, and we know that he had classical books. He had 2 volumes, the famous one by Ptolemy and another one by an Arabic scholar. And by the way, I should add that Islamic science and Arabic scholars were very influential for Leonardo, as they were for the whole Renaissance. So he had 2 books on astronomy, and he has lots of geometric drawings in his notebooks, you know, circles, triangles, squares. So he must have drawn some orbits, Ptolemaic orbits, but we don't have any of that.
The pieces that were rediscovered in the 60s, where were they rediscovered? How did they go missing?
Oh, this is a funny story. They were stored in a monastery in a library and were catalogued as being in such and such a room on such and such a shelf. And there they were. And then the catalog was copied, and somebody made an error. The monk who copied made an error in the number, in the catalog number. So when they looked up the new catalog, they didn't find the codices. So for 300 years, they were in the same place where they always were, but they were lost. And then somebody was so clever to think maybe there's an error here, and then they found them. Yeah. So who knows? We might find others. My dream was, of course, that something would be found while I was writing. I spent 10 years on this work, you know? So I thought, while I'm doing this, maybe somebody will find another codex, and I will be the first one to analyze it. But it didn't happen.
You can always write an extension of the book later, should that come about. For someone who was fascinated by living things, how did Leonardo justify to himself the design of machines of war?
Oh, this is a difficult issue. Leonardo abhorred war. He called it a bestial madness, and he made various statements against violence. He was a very gentle, non-violent person, and yet he designed war machines. There are two levels of an answer, 3 actually. The first is that he realized that being employed as a military engineer was good money. He always wanted to have a stable income to do his research, and being a military engineer was a stable source of income. So he offered his services of military inventions. He actually never went to battles, and the machines, most of his machines were never built, but still. But then there's a second level, and that is that he was fascinated by the violence in the sense of natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, and things like that. He was just fascinated by the forces of nature. He made a series of drawings known as the deluge drawings, very dark, with black chalk drawings of destructions of towns by hurricanes and so on. So he was fascinated with the forces of nature, and I think also with the forces of war. And when I discuss this, I come to the conclusion that ultimately we cannot understand a genius of that caliber and think that everything is clear and that there are no contradictions. Mm-hmm. There are contradictions. And, you know, Picasso was not a nice person, you know. We have to accept that people we admire, you know, in their private life, we wouldn't admire them. And with Leonardo, it's the case with the war machines that we don't admire, but that was part of his nature also.
Did he see that as a contradiction? Did he have any interior wrangling over taking money from military
No,
work?
see, he never wrote about these things. He never wrote about personal, emotional things. But we have indications that when he was working as a military engineer for Cesare Borgia, the very violent military man, who was, by the way, the son of a pope, Borgia and Leonardo and Machiavelli, another famous person in Tuscany, were holed up in a military camp during a whole winter. And imagine what conversations they would have had, but we don't have any record. But after that winter, Leonardo left the employ of Borgia very quickly, abruptly, possibly without being paid. So maybe he was really disgusted when he got to know him personally. But that's just, you know, speculation.
Right. Do you have any of Leonardo's failures that you think we can learn from after we look at all of his successes and all of his positive work? Do we look at anything that he failed and say, now that's a lesson also?
Oh, that's a difficult question. I mean, I'm so infatuated by Leonardo that it's a difficult question. I could say where his gaps were, you know. He studied everything, but he was not interested in social phenomena or political phenomena, and you can construct this as a failure, that when he lived in Milan, he worked for the Duke of Milan, the Sforza, Ludovico Sforza, and when the French invaded Milan and chased the Sforza away, he immediately worked for the French without any qualms. They knew about his fame, they admired him. He designed a villa for the new French governor, and so he could switch allegiances, or he didn't have any political allegiances, so there was no moral issue for him. So maybe that you can say was a failure. But again, we don't know his thinking.
Yeah, well,
so
and as you say, a lot of his writing is missing, so perhaps this is something that he did go into.
Yeah. But we can also say that among all the sciences, the social sciences are a big whole. He was not interested in human society, the structure of human society. Of course, you know, sociology came much later in the history of science, but still, he could have been interested in.
I want to bring this into the present tense. You attended and presented, I believe, at a workshop with business groups. This was November 7th. There was kind of the thinking of business around sustainability and sustainable science. What came out of that was of interest to our audience?
Now, which one? I do this quite a lot, so I don't know what you are.
Where were you on November 7th?
Just a few days ago, you mean?
Yeah, Bainbridge Graduate Institute.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That was just 3 days ago. Well, this is a very good program, which Bainbridge Graduate Institute is a management school, and within it is a program which was first separate and now they joined together. And I have been teaching courses in that other program called OSR, which stands for Organization Systems Renewal, and I teach systems thinking and ecology and sustainability to young professionals who get an MSc. And I've done this for about 8 years, and this is a group of about 20 to 30 people who form working groups and who go into companies and present cases, and I, with a colleague, Linda Booth Sweeney, we try and show them how systems thinking can help understand a problem, you know, connecting the dots, making the whole system visible, figuring out underlying processes and so on. And I really enjoy doing that.
And the reason I ask about it is because, you know, we talked earlier about the potential resistance in larger corporations or profit-driven groups to doing systematic science or to keeping life at the center of things. And I wonder if this is a part of that, where you're talking to people who are
absolutely, and there are various places. There's one in San Francisco called the Presidio School of Management, who do the same, sustainability and management, and there are several others. This is something that is coming up now.
What about the political element of that? It strikes me as ironic that Leonardo was essentially apolitical, but you know, nowadays to integrate that kind of thinking and to integrate that approach to science, it's almost inevitably political.
Yes.
So how do we tackle that?
Yes, and in fact, in my textbook, The Systems View of Life, which, by the way, I wrote with a colleague, an Italian biologist called Luisi, Pierluigi Luisi, and the whole last part of the book is, if you wish, political because it's about applications. So this is where we talk about climate change, about energy, about agriculture, eco-design, sustainability, this whole problematique we talk about in the last part. So there is definitely a political dimension to all of that.
Aside from the missing pieces of Leonardo's writings, what else is going to prompt you to expand on this for another book? What else do you want to cover in Leonardo's life that you didn't get a chance to finish out?
Well, I think at the moment I feel that I'm done with Leonardo. I don't know how long this will last, but I had a very hard time getting away from him, and in the last 6 months, I sort of distanced myself. I still follow things that are being discovered and discussed, and you know, I have a large readership, and they send me things about new things that are being discovered and so on. But I'm not going back to reading notebooks. I may again, but I can tell you that there are lots of things that can be done. For example, there could be an entire book about his fluid dynamics, his studies of the movements of water that does not exist. And I was very fortunate that I met an Italian professor of fluid dynamics who teaches in Canada, and he's a Leonardo fan. And I met him via his professional papers and his website, and then I got to know him. And he helped me analyze, or he did it for me, he didn't help me. He analyzed about 30 of Leonardo's drawings on turbulent flows of water. And he told me, this is really important, this is less important, here he made a mistake, this is completely correct. And so my chapter on fluid dynamics is the first you will read anywhere where these drawings are analyzed in detail. But there could and should be a whole book about it. Another big subject, I think I'm the first to present Leonardo as a designer. And there's another book there, you know, Leonardo and Design. He was active in all the fields of design we know today, from graphic design to costume design, landscape design, industrial design, architectural design. He did it all. And a book about Leonardo as a designer would be fabulous.
So you won't write those, but if we discover another 300-year-old clerical error, you can come back and write another book if necessary.
Yeah, right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been wonderful.
Well, thank you. That was a great conversation. Thank you. Thank you.